Augustus Reed was 74 years old, a man who had spent 50 years putting up towers across a city that had mostly forgotten his name, and who still wore work boots under a plain suit because his feet had never learned to trust anything else. He moved slowly now. Leaning on a cane he'd carved himself from a beam left over from his first build. He liked to arrive before the morning rush and sit in the lobbies of the buildings he'd made, watching the light come through glass he'd once specified by hand. That Tuesday morning, sitting on a bench in the marble lobby of the tallest of them, an old man in a worn suit, he was approached by the building's new property manager, who took one look at him and called security to have him removed. She told the guards he was loitering, that he didn't belong, that people like him made the tenants uncomfortable. She had no idea the building was his. She was about to find out, in front of the entire morning crowd. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The lobby was quiet at that hour, the polished stone catching the first flat light of morning, the great glass front still cool before the sun cleared the building across the street. Augustus Reed came in a little after 7, the way he came most Tuesdays, slowly, the rubber tip of his cane tapping a soft rhythm across the marble. He was the kind of man who noticed what a building was doing when it thought no one important was watching. He noticed the way the morning light moved across the floor, whether the revolving door had developed the faint shudder it got when it wasn't maintained, whether the plants by the elevators were real, or had quietly been swapped for the kind that never needed water. He had spent 50 years learning that a building tells the truth about itself in the small hours, before the people who run it have arrived to perform. He wore the plain suit and the old boots. He carried no briefcase, only the cane he'd carved himself from a length of timber salvaged off his very first job, a warehouse he'd put up at 24 that was still standing across the river. He drove no car at that hour. He walked the 8 blocks from his apartment, slowly, because his doctor told him to, and because he liked seeing the street wake up. That Tuesday, he wanted only to sit a while in the lobby of the tower he considered the best thing he'd ever made, and watch the light come through the glass, and feel whether the building was being cared for the way a thing like that deserved. Lately, he'd had the sense that something in the management of it had gone wrong, the way places go wrong when the people running them forget what they're for. He did not know yet how right that instinct was. He was about to learn it the hard way, sitting on a bench, treated like a man the building wanted swept out before the tenants arrived. Her name was Sloane Whitaker, and she had managed the property for 5 months. She was 31 and polished and ambitious, in the way of someone who has confused the surface of a thing for its substance. She had come from a firm that managed luxury properties the way you'd manage a brand, and she had spent her first months there sanding the building down to something glossy and frictionless, the kind of place where nothing inconvenient was ever visible in the lobby. She had a sharp eye for what she called the tenant experience, by which she meant the comfort of the people who paid the most, and a blind spot the exact shape of everyone else. She had a way of being warm to the executives who came through in good suits, and brisk to the couriers and the cleaners and the maintenance crew, as if warmth were a currency she could not afford to spend on people who couldn't return it. The longtime staff had noticed. None of them had said anything, because she reported straight to the management company and saying something cost more than it was worth. That morning she came in early to walk the lobby before the rush, and she saw an old man in a worn suit sitting on one of the benches near the glass, not waiting for an elevator, not meeting anyone, just sitting. And to her, that was a problem to be solved before it could be seen. What she did not know, what she had never once thought to wonder in 5 months of walking that floor, was that the old man on the bench had drawn the first sketch of the lobby she was so anxious to keep pristine, on a drafting table, by hand, 40 years before she was born. 50 years before that Tuesday, Augustus Reed had started with nothing but a borrowed level and a willingness to do the work no one else wanted. He had grown up in a part of the city that the developers of his youth only ever visited to tear something down. He had watched his own neighborhood get cleared, block by block, by men in good suits who never once asked the people who lived there what they thought. And he had watched his father, a bricklayer, help build the towers that replaced them and never be allowed to walk through their front doors in his work clothes. He had been a boy then. He had decided something watching his father use the service entrance of a building his own hands had raised, and it had taken him 40 years to be able to build the answer to it. So he had become the thing that had cleared his neighborhood, except turned the other way. He put up buildings, yes, but he put them up with the people of a place rather than over them. He kept the ground floors open to the public when every consultant told him to wall them off. He built benches into his lobbies on purpose, real ones, because he believed a great building owed the city a place to simply sit. And he had fought his own architects to keep them when they called the benches a liability. The tower he was sitting in that morning had been the hardest fight of all, and the benches had been the thing he refused to give up. He still owned it. He had stepped back from the daily running of his company years ago and let a management firm handle the operations, but the building was his, held in his own name, his signature on the deed in a file most of the current staff had never seen. And he still did this, once in a while. Came in early, in the plain suit, and sat on one of his own benches like any citizen, to find out what his building had become when it thought no one who mattered was there. There was one person in the building who knew his face. An older woman named Ruth Delgado, 69, small and straight-backed with silver hair pinned tight, who had run the newsstand in that lobby for 31 years, since the week the doors first opened. She had known Augustus from the beginning, from back when he'd stop at her counter every morning and they were both young, and she had kept his secret through every quiet visit since. Because she understood exactly why a man who owned a tower would want to sit in it, unseen. That was what Sloane Whitaker had never understood about the building she was so determined to keep flawless, until the morning she decided the flaw was an old man on a bench. She crossed the lobby with the brisk, certain stride of a person who has already made up her mind. She did not come to ask if he needed anything. She came to remove an obstruction, and the difference was visible in the first step. "Sir," she said, in the smooth, cool voice she used for people she'd already filed away. "Sir, this lobby is for tenants and their guests. Are you here to see someone?" Augustus looked up at her. "I'm just sitting a while," he said quietly. "It's a good bench. I'll be no trouble." "I'm afraid you can't just sit here," Sloane said. "This isn't a public space. We have a certain standard, and frankly, you're making the morning tenants uncomfortable." She was already lifting her radio. "I'm going to have security help you out." A few of the early arrivals slowed, the way people do when they sense something unkind about to happen and would rather not be part of it. 2 guards came over. One of them, an older man named Hollis who had worked that lobby for 2 decades, recognized Augustus and went still, caught between a manager's order and something he knew that she didn't. The younger guard reached for the old man's arm. Augustus did not raise his voice. He did not tell her who he was, though the telling would have ended it in a single sentence. He did none of that, because the moment he did, the lesson would become about his power, and he had spent his whole life learning that the truest thing about a building was how it treated a man who appeared to have none. He put both hands on the head of his cane and rose, slowly, on his own. "I can stand on my own, son," he said gently to the young guard, and the guard, hearing something in it, let go. He noticed, the way he noticed things, that the older guard Hollis would not look at Sloane, and that Ruth at the newsstand had gone very still, her hand frozen above the papers. He filed that away without deciding yet what to do with it. He did not let it change his face. "All right," he said. That was all. He gathered nothing, because he had brought nothing. He turned, leaning on the cane he'd carved from his first building, and began to make his way slowly toward the great glass doors. And Sloane, already turning back to her mourning, took it for an old man giving up. He didn't move fast. That was the part she could not have predicted, because she had already decided he had nothing left to move with. He did not go far. He stopped at Ruth Delgado's newsstand, the way he always did, and Ruth came out from behind her counter with her hand pressed to her chest. And then she was furious, in the quiet, controlled way of a woman who had watched something she could not abide. "You sit back down on that bench, Augustus Reed," she said, low enough that only he could hear it. "And you let me make a phone call I've been wanting to make for 5 months. You saw," he said. It was not a question. "I've been watching it since the day she got here." Ruth's voice was even, but her eyes weren't. "I'm going to tell you what I've seen, and then you're going to decide what kind of man you want to be about it." She laid it out the way she'd watched the lobby for 3 decades, in order, without drama. The courier last winter, made to wait outside in the cold because Sloane didn't want delivery people visible during a tenant tour. The old tenant from the 14th floor, a widow who'd lived there 20 years, spoken to like a trespasser because she'd come down in her housecoat for the morning paper. The benches, which Sloane had twice put in writing she wanted removed, because people sat on them who weren't paying for the privilege. "And there's a boy," Ruth said, and here her steady voice caught for just a moment. "Comes in most afternoons after school, sits in the corner by the window, and does his homework where the light's good. His mother cleans offices on the 9th floor. He's been doing it for 2 years, Augustus, quiet as anything, never bothered a soul. 3 weeks ago she told him he couldn't be here anymore. Told a 12-year-old boy he was making the building look bad. He doesn't come in now. He sits on the steps outside in the cold instead, where I can see him through the glass, and I haven't been able to do a thing about it, because she'd have my stand pulled the minute I crossed her." Augustus listened to all of it without interrupting. The benches were the part he had fought architects and consultants and his own board over for 40 years. But the boy was the part that found the old wound directly. The boy doing his homework in the good light of a lobby his own hands had not built, sent out to the cold steps the way Augustus's father had been sent to the service entrance, by someone who had decided he made the place look wrong. When Ruth finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "This is what I came in to find," he said. "I just didn't think I'd find it from the wrong end of it." He made one phone call from the bench, not to a lawyer, not to the press, but to the man who ran his company now, a steady executive named Theo Banks, who was one of the few people alive who knew Augustus's voice on the first word. He told him, plainly, without heat, what had happened in the lobby and what Ruth had described. He did not ask for the woman to be destroyed. "I don't want her thrown out on the street," Augustus said. "That only teaches her she got caught, not what she did. I want to understand how a building I made to hold a door open for this whole city started slamming it in people's faces. And I want it fixed, so it can't quietly happen to the next person who walks in looking like they don't belong." Theo understood the distinction. It was the difference between a man who wanted to win and a man who wanted a thing repaired. And in the years he'd worked for Augustus, he had learned the old man was always the second kind. "I can be there in an hour," Theo said. Out in the lobby, Sloane Whitaker was having an ordinary morning. The old man had gone, or so she assumed. She hadn't looked closely enough to notice he was sitting at the newsstand. The tenants flowed through. The lobby gleamed. She thought, to the degree she thought of him at all, that the matter was handled. Theo Banks arrived 50 minutes later. He moved through a lobby the way people move when they don't have to ask where anything is. The building noticed him before it understood why. A man in a dark, plainly expensive suit. Two people from the management company a step behind, crossing the marble with unhurried certainty. Sloane came to meet him, her professional warmth already switched on, assuming this was a visit she could manage, perhaps even use. He greeted her politely. Then he asked her to walk with him to the benches near the glass, where an old man in a worn suit sat with both hands resting on a hand-carved cane, watching the morning light come through the window he had specified by hand 50 years before. "Miss Whitaker," Theo said. "I understand you had this gentleman removed from the lobby this morning." "I asked security to help him out, yes," Sloane said, her certainty already thinning at the edges without her knowing why. "He was loitering. He's not a tenant." "No," Theo agreed. "He's not a tenant." He looked at the old man, and then back at her, and let the silence do part of the work. "I'd like to introduce you properly, since you didn't give yourself the chance this morning. This is Augustus Reed. He built this tower 50 years ago. He owns it. The benches you've twice asked to have removed, the ones you found him sitting on, he fought his own architects to put them there, because he believed this lobby owed the city a place to sit. The deed to the building you manage has his name on it." The thing that moved across Sloane's face went through several stages in the space of 2 seconds. Recognition. Disbelief. And then the specific stillness of a person feeling the floor open beneath the things she had been standing on. Augustus rose, slowly, on his cane. He looked at her, and when he spoke it was quiet, and it was meant for her and not for the lobby that had begun, very faintly, to gather. "You told me people like me make the tenants uncomfortable," he said. "My father laid the brick for buildings he was never allowed to walk into through the front door. I spent 50 years making sure the buildings with my name on them would never do that to anybody." He paused, both hands on the head of the cane. "I'm not going to take your job from you this morning. I'm going to ask you to do something harder. I'm going to ask you to learn the names of every person in this lobby you've decided not to see." He turned and made his way slowly toward the great glass doors, leaning on the cane he'd carved from his first building, out into the full light of the morning. And he did not look back. It did not happen all at once. Sloane Whitaker was not thrown into the street, which was more grace than she had shown the widow in the housecoat or the courier in the cold. She was suspended, and then, on Augustus's specific instruction, she was reassigned to the part of his company that managed the older, smaller buildings he kept in the neighborhoods other developers had abandoned, the ones that operated at a loss because he refused to close them. She spent her days now among exactly the people she had spent 5 months deciding weren't worth her warmth. Some weeks it changed her. Some weeks it only exhausted her. She carried the weight of the morning the way a person carries something they cannot set down. Not dramatically, just constantly. The benches stayed. Augustus put it in writing that they could never be removed, a clause with his own name behind it. The widow from the 14th floor got a knock on her door and an apology and a standing invitation to the morning paper on the house. The boy came back. Augustus had Ruth find out his name and his mother's, and a corner of the lobby was set aside with a proper table and a good lamp, a quiet place for any child whose parent worked in the building to sit and do their homework in the warm. The boy was the first to use it. Augustus stopped to talk with him once, an old man and a 12-year-old at a table by the glass, and asked him what he was studying, and listened to the answer, and did not tell him any of the rest of it, because it would not have helped the boy to carry it. The table is still there. There is a small brass plate on the lamp that says, "For anyone who reads it, that the light in this corner is for the people who were told they made the place look wrong. Most people walk past it without reading it. The ones who stop understand. Hollis, the older guard who had gone still rather than carry out an order he knew was wrong, was the one Augustus remembered. He was moved into the head of lobby security that spring, given a path, because he had chosen to hesitate when hesitating was the harder thing. Ruth Delgado kept her newsstand. She told Augustus she had no intention of retiring, that she'd close the stand the day they carried her out and not an hour sooner. And Augustus, who understood that kind of stubbornness better than most, told her the stand was hers for as long as she wanted it, and put that in writing too. On a cold morning the following December, almost a year after the day on the bench, Augustus Reed walked the 8 blocks from his apartment the way he did most Tuesdays, slow, the cane tapping its soft rhythm on the sidewalk. He came in a little after 7, into the quiet lobby, the polished stone catching the first flat light of morning. He nodded to Hollis at the security desk, who nodded back and called him Mr. Reed now. He stopped at Ruth's newsstand for a paper he didn't really need, the way he always had. Then he crossed slowly to the bench by the glass, the one he'd fought a lifetime to keep, and he sat down on it, an old man in a plain suit, and watched the morning light come through the window he had built. And no one came to move him. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.